The dawn of April 23rd, 1831, broke over Ascension Parish with a deceptive tranquility, the kind of stillness that often precedes a storm. In the heart of the Louisiana Delta, the air was heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, rotting perfume of the bayou. Spanish moss draped over the ancient cypress trees like the ragged shrouds of long-dead ghosts, swaying gently in the humid breeze that rolled across the white moss plantation. This sprawling estate, covering 3,000 acres of black, fertile soil, was a kingdom unto itself, where sugarcane stalks rose like green walls against the horizon, hiding secrets in their dense shadows. But before we unravel one of the most gruesome and suppressed mysteries in the annals of American history, I have a request for you. If you are listening from the Deep South or anywhere where history whispers from the soil, tell us your location in the comments below. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the story I am about to tell you, a story of vengeance that defies belief, has been scrubbed from the textbooks for nearly 2 centuries. Now, let us return to that misty morning when the natural order of the world was violently overturned. Before we step into the darkness, comment "Justice" below, so I know you are ready to face the truth. Let's begin. Samuel Broussard, the overseer of White Moss, was a man hardened by the brutal realities of plantation life, accustomed to the sounds of labor and the quiet rhythms of the morning. But at 5:45 a.m., as he inspected the western perimeter, a sound tore through the mist that stopped his heart in his chest. It was not the call of a rooster or the shout of a worker. It was a scream, and it was not just one voice, but a chorus of agony, a ragged, primal, terrified shrieking that sounded less like men and more like animals being flayed alive. The noise erupted from the dense woodlands bordering the livestock pens on the eastern edge of the property. Instinct took over. Broussard gripped his rifle, his knuckles turning white, and sprinted toward the tree line. He was joined by 2 field hands, Joseph and Eli, who had frozen in their tracks, their eyes wide with a terror that transcended their station. The screaming lasted for an eternity, perhaps 2 full minutes, high-pitched and desperate, before it was severed by a silence so sudden and absolute it felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on their eardrums. When the trio finally burst through the underbrush and into the clearing near the hog pens, the morning sun was just beginning to burn off the fog, revealing a tableau that would be etched into their nightmares until their dying days. The earth here was churned up, the mud slick and dark, but it wasn't just rain that had soaked the soil. It was blood. Pools of it had turned the dirt into a crimson slush, splashing up against the trunks of the trees and painting the grass in horrific, abstract patterns. Yet, as Broussard spun in a circle, rifle raised, looking for the source of the carnage, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. There were no bodies. There were no corpses, no wounded men writhing in the dirt. Instead, the clearing was littered with the detritus of a massacre. A torn leather vest lay in the muck. A shirt, shredded to ribbons, hung from a low bush, and most disturbingly, 5 pairs of heavy riding boots remained, some standing upright in the mud as if their owners had simply been vaporized out of them in mid-stride. Broussard stepped forward, his boots squelching in the gore, and knelt to retrieve a sodden object lying near the center of the slaughter. It was a wide-brimmed felt hat, stained dark but unmistakably of high quality. He turned it over in his trembling hands and saw the initials burned into the leather band inside, CM. A cold dread, colder than the grave, washed over him. Joseph, the older of the field hands, took a step back, crossing himself. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, his voice shaking. "That's Maddox's hat, and that vest yonder. That's Pike Hutchins. They were here. All 5 of them were right here." The realization hit Broussard like a physical blow. The debris scattered around them belonged to a group of men who were feared more than the devil himself in these parts. They were not just travelers. They were the most ruthless slave catchers in the Mississippi Valley. To understand the gravity of this discovery, you must understand the men who had vanished. Cyrus Maddox was a legend of cruelty, a man with a face like a roadmap of violence and eyes that held no soul. Pike Hutchins, his second in command, was a giant of a man, built like a bull, known for crushing bones with his bare hands. Then there was James DeMarco, the Creole tracker who could follow a scent through a rainstorm. Wesley Thorne, a disgraced soldier who treated hunting humans like a military campaign, and Thomas Ridley, the youngest, a sadist who giggled when he inflicted pain. These were predators, heavily armed men who traveled with whips, pistols, and knives. They were the apex of the plantation hierarchy's enforcement, the monsters that parents warned their children about in whispered tones. For 5 such men to simply disappear, leaving behind only their clothes and a lake of blood, was an impossibility. It suggested a force of violence that Broussard could not comprehend. The overseer immediately rallied a search party. Within the hour, 20 men were combing the woods, shouting the names of the missing hunters, though deep down they knew no one would answer. The tracking was easy at first. The ground told a story of frantic, blinded terror. The tracks showed that the men had been running in circles, slipping, falling, and crawling. But every trail ended abruptly, as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. It was near the large hog enclosure that the final piece of the puzzle was discovered, and it was a piece that made even the toughest men among them retch. The heavy wooden gate of the pen, usually secured with a thick iron latch, swung idly in the breeze. The pen, which usually housed nearly 40 massive hogs, beasts bred for size and aggression, some tipping the scales at over 300 pounds, was empty. The swine had scattered into the woods. It was one of the younger searchers who called out, his voice cracking. He was pointing at something gleaming white in the mud near the open gate. Broussard approached slowly. It was a bone, a human femur, stripped completely clean of flesh, glowing starkly against the dark earth. Upon closer inspection, the bone was marred by distinct, jagged grooves, crushing marks that Broussard recognized instantly from his years on the farm. They were not the marks of a knife or a saw. They were tooth marks. "Sweet Jesus," Broussard breathed, the realization settling in his gut like lead. The hogs ate them. The murmur went through the crowd like a contagion. The idea was preposterous on its face. Yes, hogs were omnivores and could be dangerous, but to take down 5 full-grown, armed men, to consume them so thoroughly in a matter of minutes that nothing remained but scattered equipment and picked clean bones. It defied logic. Unless the men had been incapacitated first, unless they had been fed to the beasts. By noon, the local law had descended upon White Moss Plantation. Sheriff Claude Dubois was a man who preferred his days quiet and his meals heavy, but the scene at the plantation had shaken him from his lethargy. He arrived with 3 deputies, their horses nervous and skittish, smelling the lingering scent of death in the air. Dubois was not a brilliant detective, but he knew the smell of foul play. He stood in the clearing, watching his deputies bag the blood-soaked clothes, his mind racing. "This wasn't an accident, Broussard," Dubois muttered, chewing on an unlit cigar. "Hogs don't coordinate an ambush. Someone opened that gate. Someone knew these men were here, and someone wanted them dead." He turned his gaze toward the slave quarters, a row of small, weathered cabins visible in the distance. The machinery of the law began to turn, grinding slowly toward an investigation that would uncover secrets buried deep in the soil of White Moss. The interviews began immediately. Dubois set up a makeshift interrogation post on the veranda of the main house, calling up every soul on the plantation, from the field hands to the stable boys. The story that emerged was consistent. The 5 slave catchers had arrived the previous evening, just before sunset, their horses foaming and tired. They were tracking a runaway from upriver and needed a place to camp and rest before resuming the hunt at dawn. Monsieur Bowman, the plantation owner, had granted them permission to set up camp near the eastern woods, close to the livestock pens, to keep them away from the main house, but close enough to water their horses. They had been seen laughing, drinking coffee, and cleaning their weapons. They were confident men, secure in their power. But as Dubois pressed harder, asking who had been near the camp, who had seen them last, one name began to surface. It was spoken quietly, with a mixture of fear and reverence. Ada Maybelle. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. She worked in the plantation kitchen, a woman of 29 years who carried the weight of a century in her eyes. The other slaves described her as the silent one. She was small, unassuming, a ghost in her own life who moved through the plantation with a mechanical efficiency that made her almost invisible to the white residents. But Dubois noticed the way the other slaves looked when they said her name, a fleeting glance, a shifting of feet. They knew something. He learned that Ada had been the one sent to deliver the evening meal to the slave catchers' camp the night before. She was likely the last person to see Cyrus Maddox and his crew alive. Dubois closed his notebook with a snap. "Bring me the kitchen woman," he ordered. "Bring me Ada Mabel." And as the deputy went to fetch her, the sun began to dip lower, casting long, bloody shadows across the cane fields, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the South. When Ada Mabel was brought before Sheriff Dubois, she did not look like a killer of men. She was a diminutive figure, standing barely 5 feet tall, her frame slight and wiry under the rough cotton of her work dress. Her hands, resting quietly at her sides, were a map of her life's labor, knuckles swollen from scrubbing, skin thickened by burns from the cast-iron stove, palms calloused from the handle of a knife. But it was her face that unsettled the sheriff. In his line of work, Dubois was accustomed to fear. He expected the trembling lips, the darting eyes, the frantic pleas of innocence that usually poured from slaves accused of even the smallest infractions. Ada offered none of this. Her face was a mask of unnatural calm, her eyes dark and unreadable, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the sheriff's left shoulder. She stood in the center of the room with a stillness that felt less like submission and more like the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a composure that did not belong in an interrogation room, and it sent a prickle of unease down the sheriff's spine. "You served them," Dubois began, his voice heavy with authority, trying to crack her facade. "The 5 men camped by the woods. You took them their supper." Ada nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice soft but steady, devoid of the tremor he expected. "Chicken, cornbread and beans, just as Monsieur Bowman ordered." Dubois leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on the table. "And did you speak to them? Did they say anything to you?" "No, sir. I set the food down and I left." The lie was smooth, seamless. There was no hesitation, no flicker of deceit in her gaze. Dubois studied her, looking for a crack. He knew the kitchen staff heard everything. They were the invisible witnesses to the plantation's secrets. "Did you go back, later in the night? Did you see anyone else approaching the camp?" "No, sir. I went to my quarters. I was with my daughter and the other women until the morning bell." It was a solid alibi, one that would be corroborated by the other slaves out of loyalty or fear, but Dubois felt the weight of the unspoken truth hanging in the humid air between them. "Did you know those men, Ada?" Dubois asked, suddenly changing his angle. "Had you ever seen them before?" For the first time the mask slipped. It was microscopic, a mere tightening of the muscles around her jaw, a flash of something ancient and cold in her eyes. But Dubois caught it. It was the look of a wound that had never healed, a hatred that had calcified into something harder than bone. "I knew them," she whispered, the temperature in the room seeming to drop. "They were here 2 years ago." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a haunting resonance. "They brought my husband back." The sheriff froze. He remembered the incident now, a vague recollection of a runaway hunt in 1829 that had ended badly. But as Ada continued, the vague memory sharpened into a gruesome clarity. She wasn't just talking about a capture. She was talking about an execution that had destroyed her world. To understand the woman standing before the sheriff, one had to understand the ghosts that stood beside her. 2 years prior, Ada had been a different woman. She had been capable of laughter, of singing while she worked, of dreaming of a life beyond the cane fields. She was married to Solomon, a man of strong back and stronger spirit, and together they had carved out a sliver of happiness in the hell of enslavement. They had 2 children, Isaac, a bright-eyed boy of 6, and Ruth, a toddler. But Solomon harbored a dangerous hope. He had heard whispers of the North, of freedom, and in June of 1829 that hope drove him into the swamps. He ran, guided by the stars and a desperate prayer. But he didn't make it. Cyrus Maddox and his crew, the very men who now lay in pieces in the woods, had tracked him with dogs. They cornered him near the Yazoo River, 40 miles away. Solomon had fought back, refusing to be taken in chains, and the slave catchers had exacted a terrible price for his defiance. They didn't just kill him, they made an example of him. They dragged his battered body back to White Moss Plantation behind their horses. But the cruelty didn't end with death. To teach a lesson to the other slaves, the overseer and the catchers had hoisted Solomon's corpse into a cypress tree near the riverbank. They left him there for 3 days. 3 days of heat, of flies, of the slow indignity of decomposition. And for 3 days, Ada was forced to walk past that tree. She was forced to look at the man she loved, the father of her children, reduced to rotting meat for the buzzards. She held Isaac's hand as he wept, unable to shield his eyes from the horror, unable to explain why the world was so monstrous. It was a psychological torture designed to break the spirit completely, to crush the soul so thoroughly that the thought of resistance would be impossible. But in Ada, it had achieved the opposite. It hadn't broken her. It had hollowed her out, removing her fear and replacing it with a cold, focused void. But the tragedy of 1829 had a second, darker chapter. A week after they finally cut Solomon down and buried him in the shallow earth, 6-year-old Isaac vanished. He simply disappeared from the yard where he had been playing. The official story, whispered by the overseer, was that the boy had wandered into the bayou, perhaps taken by an alligator or lost in the treacherous currents. But Ada knew the truth. She had seen the slave catchers lingering that day, packing their gear to leave. She had seen Thomas Ridley, the youngest and most sadistic of the group, watching her with a cruel, knowing smirk. As he mounted his horse, he had looked down at her and said, loud enough for her to hear, "Guess that boy went to find his daddy." The implication was clear, sickeningly so. They had taken her son. They had disposed of him, likely killing him in the woods as a final petty act of malice against the family of the man who had dared to fight them. That moment was the death of Ada Mabel, the woman who wept, who pleaded, who felt pain. She died that day, along with her son. In her place rose the silent one. She stopped speaking unless spoken to. She performed her work with terrifying perfection. She became a vessel of pure endurance, keeping her remaining daughter Ruth close to her side at all times. She watched the seasons change, watched the cane grow and fall, and she waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for, but she knew that the universe owed her a debt. So when she looked at Sheriff Dubois in that interrogation room, she wasn't seeing a lawman. She was seeing another cog in the machine that had devoured her family. "They killed my boy," she told him, her voice flat. "I know it like I know my own name. They took him and they killed him." Dubois stared at her, unsettled by her absolute certainty. He knew that even if she was right, the law offered her no recourse. A slave's word against 5 white men was smoke in the wind. The investigation dragged on for 3 days, but the sheriff found himself circling back to Ada. The physical evidence at the scene was baffling. The open gate, the scattered clothes, the sheer violence of the hog attack. But the motive was the only thing that made sense. Who else had a reason to unleash such hell upon those specific men? The other slaves feared them, yes, but Ada hated them with the specific potent hatred of a grieving mother. Yet, the logistics gnawed at Dubois. How could a small woman, barely 100 pounds soaking wet, overpower 5 armed, experienced killers? How could she force them into a pen of man-eating hogs? It seemed impossible. Had she drugged them? The camp showed no sign of a struggle before the pen. Had she had help? No other slave would dare risk such a thing. The how remained a mystery, locked behind Ada's silent stare, but the why was screaming from the rooftops. On April 26th, driven by the pressure to close the case and the undeniable instinct that Ada was the architect of this nightmare, Sheriff Dubois returned to White Moss with a warrant. He didn't have the weapon, he didn't have a witness, but in 1831 Louisiana, suspicion was enough. He found Ada in the kitchen, slicing okra with rhythmic, precise strokes. When he announced she was under arrest for murder, she didn't flinch. She didn't drop the knife in shock. She simply set it down on the table, wiped her hands on her apron and untied the strings at her waist. It was as if she had been expecting him every minute of every day for the last 2 years. "Can I say goodbye to my daughter?" was her only request. It wasn't a beg, it was a negotiation. Dubois, feeling a strange mixture of pity and fear, nodded. "Make it fast." The scene that followed broke the hearts of even the hardened deputies. Ada called for Ruth, now 8 years old, a thin girl with eyes too big for her face. When Ruth saw the shackles, she wailed, a sound of pure heartbreak that echoed the screams of the lost men. Ada dropped to her knees, not to plead with the officers, but to level herself with her child. She grabbed Ruth's shoulders, her grip firm, shaking the girl slightly to focus her attention. "You listen to me. Ada commanded, her voice fierce and low. "You dry those tears. You remember who you are. They can take my body, they can take me away, but they cannot touch what is inside you unless you let them. Do you hear me?" Ruth nodded, sobbing into her mother's chest. Ada held her for a long moment, pouring every ounce of her remaining strength into the child, before standing up. She turned to the sheriff, her face dry, her expression composed. "I'm ready." As they led her to the wagon, the other slaves watched in a hushed vigil, witnessing the departure of a woman who had walked into the fire and refused to burn. The jail in Donaldsonville was little more than a brick oven, a stifling box designed to break the will of those unfortunate enough to be thrown inside. Ada sat on the edge of a narrow cot, the iron door locked tight, staring at the sliver of light crawling across the stone floor. For the first time in days, the mask she wore, the obedient servant, the grieving widow, the silent ghost, fell away. In the solitude of her cell, she allowed herself to revisit the night of the murders, not with fear, but with the cold satisfaction of a debt finally paid. The sheriff had asked her how. How did a small woman kill 5 armed men? The answer was simple, terrifyingly so. It wasn't brute force, it was chemistry and patience. It had started the moment she recognized Cyrus Maddox's scarred face by the firelight. The plan hadn't formed slowly. It had struck her like lightning, a sudden perfect clarity that this was the moment she had been kept alive for. She remembered walking to the plantation smokehouse, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. In the corner, on a high shelf, sat a jar of rendered lard. It was common practice on the Delta plantations to mix arsenic into specific jars of grease to use as bait for the massive rats that plagued the storerooms. It was a deadly poison, tasteless and odorless when mixed with the heavy fat. Ada had taken that jar. She hadn't trembled, she hadn't hesitated. She had carried it to the slave catcher's camp with the demeanor of a helpful servant. "Mr. Bowman sent this for your morning cooking," she had said, her voice dropping into the submissive register that made white men stop seeing her as a threat. Maddox had barely grunted, waving her away. They saw a slave bringing supplies. They didn't see the angel of death placing a weapon right beside their coffee pot. But poisoning them wasn't enough. Poison was too quiet, too gentle for men who had beaten her husband to a bloody pulp. The second part of her plan required a darkness that Ada had found in the deepest recesses of her grief. Later that night, while the plantation slept under a blanket of humidity, she had crept back to the livestock pens. She carried a bucket of slop, heavily laced with the remaining arsenic lard. She poured it into the troughs for the hogs. She knew the poison wouldn't kill the massive 300-pound beasts immediately. In non-lethal doses, arsenic causes burning pain, confusion, and terrifying aggression. She fed the animals, and then she unlocked the gate. She waited in the shadows as the poison began to work its wicked magic on both the men in the camp and the beasts in the pen. When the men woke, retching and disoriented, clutching their burning stomachs, unable to stand or aim their weapons, Ada swung the gate wide. The hogs, maddened by the fire in their guts, surged out. What followed was the sound of judgment. The screaming that had alerted the overseer was music to Ada's ears. It was the sound of the predators becoming the prey. 3 days into her confinement, the door to her cell rattled open. Sheriff Dubois stood there looking grim. "Get up," he muttered. "You're being moved." The local magistrate had decided the case was too volatile, too sensational for a parish jail. A slave murdering 5 white men in such a gruesome fashion was political dynamite. Ada was to be transferred to New Orleans to face the Orleans Parish Criminal Court. She was shackled hand and foot, loaded into a reinforced wagon like a dangerous animal, and driven south along the river road. The journey took 2 days. Ada watched the landscape roll by through the slats of the wagon, the endless fields of cotton and cane, the backs of thousands of enslaved people bent under the sun. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were already dead, a spirit floating above the misery of the world, observing it one last time before departing. New Orleans hit her senses like a physical blow. The wagon rattled over cobblestones, passing through a cacophony of languages, smells, and colors. It was a city of contradictions, where immense wealth rubbed shoulders with desperate poverty, where the cries of street vendors mixed with the clatter of carriage wheels. They brought her to the Orleans Parish prison, a formidable stone fortress that smelled of damp rot and despair. She was thrown into a holding cell in the women's wing, surrounded by thieves, prostitutes, and runaways. The noise here was constant, sobbing, praying, shouting, but Ada remained an island of silence. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, preparing herself. She knew the trial was a formality. There was no defense attorney coming to save her. There would be no surprise witnesses. The verdict was written before the gavel would even bang. But as the days ticked down toward the trial, a new resolve hardened in Ada's chest. She realized she had one thing left to use: her voice. For 2 years, she had been silent. For 2 years, she had swallowed her rage. Now she was going to be put on a stage in front of the city's elite, in front of the press, in front of the world. They wanted a show. They wanted to see a monster. She would give them something else entirely. She would use their courtroom as a pulpit. They could kill her body. She had accepted that the moment she opened the hogpen gate, but they could not stop her from speaking the truth into the public record. She would strip away the pretense of their civilized society and force them to look at the blood on their own hands. The morning of the trial, May 15, 1831, arrived with a suffocating heat. The courthouse at the Cabildo on Jackson Square was besieged. Word had spread through the city like wildfire. The hog killer was to be tried. Hundreds of spectators jostled for position, fighting for a seat in the gallery. It was a spectacle, a macabre carnival. When Ada was led into the courtroom, the crowd fell into a hushed, vibrating silence. She walked slowly, the chains dragging on the floor, her head held high. She scanned the room, seeing the faces of the wealthy planters, the curious wives, the scribbling journalists. She saw the judge, Armand Delonde, a man known for his severity. He looked at her with disdain, seeing only a piece of broken property. Ada sat in the wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. The air was thick with anticipation. The players were ready. The final act of Ada Maybell's life was about to begin, and she was determined to make it a performance that history would never forget. Judge Armand Delondes banged his gavel, the sharp crack cutting through the humid murmur of the courtroom like a pistol shot. He peered over his spectacles at the small, shackled woman sitting before the bench. The charges were read aloud, a litany of violence that seemed too large for the room. 5 counts of murder, malicious destruction of property, and crimes against the state. When asked for her plea, the courtroom held its collective breath, expecting a whimper of denial or a mute stare. Instead, Ada looked the judge in the eye. "Guilty," she said. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. "I killed them all. I planned it, and I did it." The admission sent a shockwave through the gallery. District Attorney Claude Marchand, a man who had prepared a theatrical prosecution to build his political career, looked almost disappointed. He had wanted a battle. Instead, he got a surrender. But he wasn't about to let the moment pass without ensuring the crowd understood the monstrosity of the crime. Marchand launched into his case regardless of the confession, determined to paint Ada not just as a killer, but as a supernatural force of evil. He paraded the evidence before the jury: the jar of arsenic-laced lard, the shredded remnants of the men's clothing, and the testimony of the doctor who confirmed the men had been alive when the hogs began to feed. This was not a crime of passion, Marchand thundered, pacing before the jury box. This was a cold, calculated atrocity. This woman, this creature, used the very food she served to poison 5 men, rendering them helpless. Then, with a cruelty that chills the blood, she unleashed beasts to finish the job. She watched them die. She listened to their screams and did nothing. He turned to point a trembling finger at Ada. "She is a danger not just to her masters, but to the very foundation of our society. If this is not punished with the ultimate severity, we invite chaos into our homes." When it was Ada's turn to speak before sentencing, the judge expected a plea for mercy. He expected tears. What he got was an indictment. Ada stood, the chains clanking softly, and addressed the room with a voice that reached the back rows. "I did what he said," she began, her tone even. "I poisoned them. I fed them to the hogs, and I watched them die." She paused, scanning the faces of the wealthy planters in the front row. "But you need to know why. 2 years ago, those men hunted my husband Solomon like a dog. They beat him to death because he wanted to be free. They hung his body from a tree and made my children watch it rot." She took a breath, her voice hardening. "Then they took my son. Isaac was 6 years old. One of those men, Thomas Ridley, laughed about it. He said my boy went to find his daddy. They killed my child to punish me. They took everything I had." The courtroom was deadly silent. The narrative of the monster was fracturing, replaced by the image of a grieving mother pushed beyond the brink of sanity. "You call me a murderer," Ada continued, her voice rising in intensity. "But those men killed for money. They tortured for sport. They were protected by your laws, by your sheriff, by your society. When they killed my family, it was property business. When I killed them, it's a crime against nature." Tears began to stream down her face, but her voice didn't waver. "I sat in the dark and listened to them scream, and I felt nothing. No guilt, no shame, just empty, because they had already killed me 2 years ago." She looked directly at Marchand, who had taken a step back, unsettled by the raw power of her words. "You ask if I regret it? My only regret is that I couldn't kill every man who thinks he owns another human being." Judge Deslondes, his face turning a deep shade of crimson, hammered his gavel furiously. "Silence! I will not have this courtroom used as a platform for sedition." But Ada was speaking faster now, shouting over the noise of the gavel and the rising clamor of the crowd. She delivered the line that would be printed in newspapers from New Orleans to Boston, the line that would haunt the conscience of the nation. "I am not a monster," she cried out. "I only gave them the death they created. I gave them the pain they inflicted on us every single day." The guards rushed forward, seizing her arms, dragging her back from the railing. As they pulled her away, she looked back at the stunned audience, her eyes blazing. "You can kill me, but you can't kill the truth. God sees you. God sees all of you." Order was eventually restored, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted irrevocably. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, guilty on all counts, and the sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out on May 20th at dawn. But as the judge read the words, "May God have mercy on your soul," they felt hollow. Ada stood tall, her breathing heavy but her head unbowed. She had done the impossible. She had turned her own execution trial into an accusation against her executioners. As she was led out of the courtroom, the crowd parted, some jeering but many silent, staring at the small woman who had unleashed such fury. She was taken back to her cell to wait for the end, leaving a city that would never be quite the same. The date was set. The gallows were waiting. But Ada Maybell wasn't finished yet. The morning of May 20th, 1831, broke with a suffocating grey humidity, the sky sitting low and heavy over New Orleans like a bruised eyelid. The public square was already packed, a sea of faces stretching back to the levees. Thousands had gathered, some to jeer, some to witness the end of a monster, and others standing in silent clusters near the back to pay respects to a martyr. Ada was led up the rough wooden steps of the gallows. She refused the hood. "I want to see the sky," she told the hangman, her voice steady. Judge Deslondes, impatient to scrub this stain from his city's history, signaled for the proceedings to hurry. The noose was placed around her neck, the coarse hemp scratching against her skin. She looked out at the crowd, at the mixture of hatred and awe, and she smiled. It was a small, private smile, the look of a woman who knew something the rest of the world did not. She had already won. The lever was pulled, the trapdoor fell open with a sickening clack, and Ada dropped into the void. But death did not come. Instead of the sharp crack of a broken neck, there was a loud snap of tearing fibre. The rope, brand new and tested that very morning, sheared clean in two. Ada fell through the trapdoor and hit the ground beneath the platform with a heavy thud, gasping for air, bruised but alive. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the square. In the 19th century, a broken rope was often interpreted as divine intervention, a sign that God himself had rejected the judgment of the court. "A miracle!" someone screamed from the crowd. "She is innocent!" shouted another. Pandemonium erupted. The hangman stood frozen, staring at the frayed end of the noose in disbelief. But Judge Deslondes was a man of law, not superstition, and his face twisted into a mask of fury. He leaned over the railing, his face purple. "Get another rope!" he screamed, spitting with rage. "Hang her again! I don't care if every rope in this city breaks. She dies today." The brutality of what followed silenced the crowd's wonder. Guards dragged Ada, coughing and stumbling, back up the stairs. She was hauled to her feet, her neck already welting red from the first attempt. There was no mercy, no pause to consider the omen. A second rope was hastily knotted. This time there was no speech, no moment of reflection. The hangman, terrified of the judge's wrath, kicked the lever. The trapdoor swung, the rope held. At 6:47 a.m., Ada Mabel's body jerked and stilled. She was left hanging for an hour, a grim warning swaying in the morning breeze before being cut down and tossed into a pauper's grave in the potter's field. The authorities believed the matter was closed. They believed order had been restored. They were wrong. The execution was over, but the haunting of New Orleans was just beginning. That night, a strange and terrifying phenomenon gripped the city. It began in the French Quarter and spread outward like a contagion. The pig pens, thousands of them kept in backyards and alleys for meat and waste disposal, began to break open. Gates that had been latched for years swung wide. Fences collapsed. By midnight, the streets of New Orleans were flooded with swine. Thousands of hogs roamed the cobblestones, squealing and grunting, overturning carts and rooting through gardens. The chaos was absolute. Judge Deslandes woke to the sound of crashing glass, only to find 3 massive hogs destroying his parlor. The district attorney's carriage was overturned by a rampaging herd. It was as if the animals themselves had risen in rebellion, guided by the spirit of the woman who had used them as an instrument of justice. The Night of the Pigs became a local legend, a story whispered by slaves and free people of color as proof that Ada's spirit was still fighting. Ada's legacy outlived the men who killed her. Her daughter, Ruth, survived the brutality of slavery, carried by the strength of her mother's memory. She lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation and the fall of the Confederacy. She grew old, telling her children and grandchildren the story of the woman who refused to break. The story of Ada Mabel became a quiet anthem of resistance, cited by abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison as proof that the human spirit cannot be commodified. Today, a historical marker stands near the site of the old courthouse, a small plaque that acknowledges the trial that shook the South. It reminds passers-by of the woman who stood in chains and told a courtroom of powerful men that she only gave her tormentors the death they had created. So, I leave you with this question. Was Ada Mabel a cold-blooded murderer who deserved the gallows, or was she a freedom fighter pushed to the absolute limit by a system of unimaginable cruelty? Is justice always found in the law books, or does it sometimes wear a darker, more violent face? History is written by the victors, but memory belongs to the people. What do you think? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. If this story moved you, horrified you, or made you think, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth about our past. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from the shadows of history. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for someone to tell the story.